Hello, fellow fantasy sports fans. Welcome to MFSN's The Hub. I'm here, as always, with Casey Scheinvold, Fantasy Pros expert Andrew Seifter, and Ross the Boss.
Hey, everybody. I'm Ross the Boss, and I want to talk fantasy football with you, cowboy.
It's the playoffs, and we're going to talk about the strategy of the playoffs on 1st and 10.
1st and 10.
Okay, guys, so we're going to start talking about fantasy playoff strategy for football. Playoffs? And, for those of you watching, please remember, click subscribe, ring the bell, click like, and make some comments. We've been picking all of the categories so far of what we're going to talk about. We would love to hear from you. So put them in the comments, and we will consider it. Guys, what's your main way of thinking about the playoffs? I mean, suddenly the field shrinks down from usually 12 teams, maybe a 10-team league. Some have 14, but mostly 12. It shrinks down to 6 or maybe even 4. How does it change the game?
Well, I think we talked about it a little bit on the waiver wire show when we get to the drop section. I mean, I think the list of players you can feel okay dropping expands dramatically. Any player that isn't going to be in your lineup or in your opponent's lineup, it doesn't need to be on your roster, So I still believe in, stashing high upside kind of players on your bench in case maybe there's an injury that week and then you make it to the next round and suddenly you've got a great player. But I think you can also do things like stash a couple defenses, hoard a defense away from your opponent so they don't have one. Or if they're missing a tight end, grab an extra tight end to keep them away. You play that kind of a game. It's really a zero-sum game in the playoffs. So you got to look at your strengths and weaknesses and your opponents, and that's all you got to do.
Hopefully you've been following the waiver wire show all season long, and you've done a really nice job of building up the depth of your bench, because the playoffs are a different animal. It's an elimination. It can depend on matchups really heavily. If you have players on teams, it's become routine the last couple weeks of the season. Those that have their playoff seeds locked up might rest some of their best players. That can be a big factor in some of these matchups. And so it's to me, it's more of a crapshoot than a lot of the regular season stuff, because it is all the strongest teams you're playing. And Andrew makes a good point, and I think it's one that everybody should listen to, is that you're now playing more against your opponent than just building the best roster. You can weaken them and strengthen yourself at the same time, and that's one of the goals, the biggest goals in the playoffs.
And the one thing you got to remember, it's different this year. There's only one team that's kind of a bye week. One team. Which means all these teams are going to be fighting it out for that one spot for that bye week. Steelers, Chiefs, people like that. So they're not going to be resting their players quite yet. But on your roster, you don't want to get too fancy or cute. You don't want to I'm not going to start the guy that got me there to put this other idiot in there because he's playing the Jets. Don't do that. Play the best players you got available. Don't worry about the matchups that much. I mean, of course, if you have guys that are kind of close, look at the matchups. But don't sit Mahomes. Don't sit Hill. Don't sit Kelsey. Play all those guys. Don't be cute. Don't be fancy. Don't be like what the Dodgers did with their starting rotation. In previous years they would change it all up and they mess up and never won the World Series. This year they won the World Series because they went to the plan and it worked. Stay with the plan. Stay with it. It will get you through the playoffs. Trust me, I've done it.
I think that's good advice all the time, but it's especially good advice in the playoffs. I think all the things we talk about as factors, matchups, weather, all these kind of things, they matter as a tiebreaker, but they're not what you should be basing your overall decision on. And you just have to think about how you would feel if you did sit one of those star players and then you lost because of it. I mean, you couldn't live with yourself, right?
No, not at all. I would be crying every night before I went to bed.
I would move immediately.
Just like Dan does when he starts certain players he shouldn't be starting. But yes, I agree.
That's all in the past now. You guys have turned me into a fantasy football monster. You're going to see what kind of monster I already was in basketball and baseball. That's coming up. But in football, I've now arrived. I feel like I am a solid player. And I really was not at the beginning of the season. I did not understand it at all. But I do want to say, having been not that good of a player before, one thing I can tell you when you're in the playoffs, you have to think extra clear. You really have to stay logical because you're gonna get tempted by certain matchups. You may be doing extra reading. Don't get caught up in it. It's just what these guys said. Do what you would do any other week. Play your best players.
And I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but give yourself, before you start focusing on your first playoff game, give yourself a little pat on the back for making the playoffs, because that's the hardest thing to do in fantasy football is make the playoffs. Once you're in the playoffs, it's out of your control. You might have your star running back, pull his hamstring on the first carry. I have Antonio Gibson, and what happened to him in that game the other night, what happened to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, those kind of things, sunk people. People miss the playoffs because of that. That can also happen in the playoffs, and you can be out because of something like that. So you have to realize that this game is chaotic and unpredictable. You put yourself in the best position to win. But my goal, I play in multiple leagues, and my goal is to make the playoffs in every league that I play in. If I get in the playoffs in every league, I'm satisfied. I want to win the championship, but I know some years I'll maybe win 2 or 3 championships, and other years I won't win any, and that's just the way it is in this game. So you got to keep it all in perspective. And I do think, we're all pretty intense about this stuff. So it's good to take that quick moment and sort of appreciate your accomplishment.
And the other thing you got to remember is you got to look at the injury report. The player's questionable, and let's say you're not going to follow Sunday morning, you're out with the wife well, you can't really go out in Los Angeles, but you're not going to be available to look at if the person's inactive or active. You gotta take a chance and maybe not play that player and start somebody who's going to actually be playing, because I've seen it so many times. A player became inactive like 5 minutes before the game started, and that can ruin your season, and it's happened. So you got to look at the players. You got to look at the injury report. You got to take a look this week. Sometimes I blow it off. I know Casey's blown it off in the past. But that all being said, you got to be proactive this week. You made the playoffs. Pat yourself on the back, like Andrew said. But let's go for blood. Let's win this thing. Let's be in first place for once. Let's be a winner. Let's be what Ross the Boss is every night. He's a winner. You know why? Because he follows the directions that makes him the winner. And you got to listen to us. That's why our show is important for the fantasy players. Do you understand?
I understand,
Yeah, so
Ross.
fans out there, pay attention and let Ross know what you think about whether he's as good as he says. He needs some feedback. And
so injury report is very important. You know what else is important? Is looking at past performances against the team they're playing. Check it out. Take a look. Take some interest in your team. Don't be afraid of past performances like, of what they did earlier in the season, because a lot of the matchups right now are teams in the same division that they played each other already. They have a history with each other. Just check it out. Maybe you'll make a few changes in your mind that you want to do, which makes sense. But you got to be a general manager now. You got to step it up. You got to be a winner.
Going off of that, I'm going to give a piece of advice. I'm very curious to know if you guys agree with this, but this is where real life collides with your fantasy sports management, because a lot of times there's pressure in your real life to not be paying attention at the key moments. You actually do have to prioritize this. You have worked hard all season. You really should prioritize. You should tell your wife, be like, listen, I'm sorry. I'm going to be out of commission for a good half an hour before the lineups lock. I got to be able to check this. I'm serious.
My wife would love if it was just a half hour before the lineups locked for me.
Yeah, I know. I'm not. That's a different situation, but
yes, very much.
At least you've made it. That's your main career. So, but I do think that you got to prioritize. I know it sounds silly, but this isn't just a game. We love this. We love this game. This is a passion. You guys agree?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And
I'm sorry to all the wives out there, but half an hour
and the husbands
in playoff times,
and the husbands,
and the husbands, and the girlfriends,
and the husbands. Yes,
and
sorry,
the girlfriends.
Sorry,
and
accidentally
sexist
statement. I apologize.
Whatever it might be, but and this is an analogy we've used before on this show to piggyback on what Andrew and Ross have said about give yourself credit. Getting into the playoffs is a big deal, and after this, it's like I said, it's a crapshoot. So it's kind of like playing poker. You get all your money in when you have the best hand, and you might only win 60 to 65% of the time because that's what the odds say, and you just have to be willing to live with that. And that's sometimes difficult. It's not a failure to lose in the playoffs if you put your best team forward and they happen to have a bad week.
Well, another thing, just because it is all about that head-to-head matchup, I field a lot of start-sit questions on Twitter, and if anyone that's out there watching wants to ask me, I'd be happy to help you out. But what we were talking about at the beginning about not sitting your studs, that's about different categories of players. Like, you don't ever want to start an inferior player to a better player, but there are different kinds of players too. And that's where I feel like you might want to look at, are you a favorite or are you an underdog in your matchup? And if you're actually, if you look objectively and you say, you know what, my opponent has a better team than me. He's got Tyreek Hill. He's got Travis Kelce. He's loaded. He's got Aaron Rodgers. He's going to be putting up big points, and you feel like you have to go for the upside play in that situation. So if you have like two kind of similar players except in value, overall value, but one of them is like high floor, very likely to have a decent game, but very unlikely to have a huge game. The other one's a little more boom or bust, but has that possibility of actually winning you the week. You might want to lean a little more in that direction if you're a big underdog. Whereas if you're a big favorite, you want the guy who's going to get the guaranteed touches, the running back who's maybe not on a great team, but they're going to, I would say Frank Gore, but he might not play this week. But those kind of players, the players that aren't exciting, but are going to get the touches, just to lock in those points and let your star players be the ones who lead you to the victory and just make sure that last flex spot doesn't lose you the game, So I think looking at that is important.
And then, Andrew, like you said, players are fighting for positions for next year. I mean, even though the Jets are out of the playoffs, some of their players, let's say Gore, who's 100 years old, he wants to come back next year and play. Johnson, the running back for the Jets who took Gore's place.
Yeah.
I mean, he's fighting for his job for next year. So these guys that are out of the playoffs, they want to go out there and they want to get some yards. They want to get some points. And you got to remember that, like, these guys have something to prove. They're not going to just lay on their backs and not play.
Ross, I think that's a great point, is you always want to factor in the team context. You got to understand where that team is. If maybe they're not resting their players, but maybe they don't need to win as much. But you got to understand there's going to be backup players who could get a role. So you really have to understand team context, and that's all the more reason to spend more time prepping for these games. You got to understand what's happening.
Yeah, we talked about it. We talked about it on waiver wire. Matthew Stafford, I think, and so do you guys, I think he's going to have a great next 3 games. I think he's going to be a top 10 quarterback for fantasy.
I can see that happening.
I like, as I've been preaching about Kirk Cousins for the past 4 weeks, he's another one you got to worry about too. So, there's guys out there, they're not going to be in the playoff picture, but they're going to bring up points.
Don't rest on your laurels either. Keep working the waiver wire, even in the playoffs. Every year there's some player that comes out of nowhere and ends up winning people leagues. Some backup running back ends up being a superstar in week 16 or in week 15. So just because you're in the playoffs now, don't say, oh, I've got a great team, I'm going to be able to coast. You have to keep working at it.
Hear that, Casey Scheinfold? Yes.
I'm going to try.
All right, guys. Well, we hope you will all keep working. Good luck in the playoffs. Those of you who are watching, many of you, I'm sure, are in the playoffs. Those of you who aren't, you're learning how to get there. So keep at it. Lying with a blanket over my head, she asked if she could see who was under the blanket with me. I said, you don't want to find. It is Hideki Matsui in my